There was a brief, reckless window in boating history when engineering crossed the point of no return. The moment when smart ideas stopped being refined and started being dangerous. Speed limits weren't ignored, they were laughed at. Safety regulations existed only on paper, and outboard motors weren't viewed as finished raw machines, but as raw, unfinished experiments begging to be pushed harder. If a boat didn't feel unstable at wide open throttle, something was wrong. If it didn't scare the driver, it wasn't fast enough. What followed was a mechanical arms race. Modifications so extreme, they turned fishing boats into flying projectiles. Setups so effective they embarrassed factory engineers, and so lethal that governing bodies were forced to step in, not to slow things down, but to stop people from getting killed. These are the illegal outboard modifications that transformed ordinary boats into waterborne missiles, rewrote entire rulebooks, and left a permanent fingerprint on the outboard engines we run today. The first trick sounds almost too simple to be true, but that's what made it so brilliant and so dangerous. Racers ripped the exhaust housing off entirely. Normally, outboards funnel exhaust down through the midsection and out the prop hub, creating back pressure, heat, and drag. But by venting exhaust straight above the waterline, the engine suddenly breathed freely. RPM skyrocketed, and raw, savage power was unleashed. The price? Chaos. The roar was unbearable. Engines at full throttle were practically deafening. Worse, at certain speeds, exhaust fumes could swirl back into the intake, sending sudden surges of power through the boat. 1 second you were gliding, the next you were airborne or slammed flat into the water. Crashes became common, complaints stacked up, and regulators swooped in, banning open exhaust setups almost overnight. But the legacy lingered. Today's high-performance outboards still carry the DNA of those outlaw exhaust experiments. A reminder that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to discover just how fast a boat can really go. The second modification was pure obsession, blueprinting engine blocks beyond anything the factory ever imagined. Outboards from the 70s and 80s weren't built for perfection. Cylinder walls varied, port timing wavered, crankshafts were slightly off. Every engine was a roll of the dice. Racers didn't leave it to chance. They tore the engines apart and rebuilt them by hand, machining every component to extreme tolerances. Blocks were a line bored, cylinders hand-honed, ports reshaped millimeter by millimeter. Compression ratios climbed to heart-stopping levels. The engines became temperamental, fragile even, but the payoff was breathtaking speed. The problem? Fairness vanished. Two boats with identical engines could differ by 20 horsepower, turning races into a gamble. Regulators had no choice. They banned blueprinting outright, demanding engines remain as delivered. Yet, as the legacy of that reckless precision lives on, today's CNC machine blocks, capable of astonishing consistency and performance, are descendants of that dangerous rule-breaking era. Next came one of the most visually striking and terrifying modifications: nose cone extensions with low water pickups. At high speeds, a stock outboard struggles to get enough cooling water because the intake lifts out of the water as the boat rises. Racers found a brutal solution. Built on a long torpedo-shaped nose cone with the water pickup mounted at the very tip. This simple-looking tweak changed everything. Engines could now sit higher on the transom, slicing through the water with minimal drag. Speeds jumped almost immediately, sometimes by double digits. But the thrill came with a deadly price. The longer skeg and extended nose completely altered the boat's handling. At full throttle, the craft became unpredictable, prone to sudden spins, violent blowovers, and catastrophic crashes. After several fatal accidents were linked directly to extreme nose cone setups, racing authorities had no choice. They banned them across most classes. forcing racers back to safer but far slower configurations. Yet for a fleeting moment, these boats look like they could literally fly, a testament to how far ingenuity could push the edge of danger. The fourth modification took fuel delivery into outright madness. Stock carburetors were designed to be safe and predictable, perfectly fine for a family boat, disastrous for a racer chasing every ounce of speed. The fix? Swap them for oversized carburetors borrowed from snowmobiles, motorcycles, or even small aircraft engines. Some boats ran multiple carbs feeding a single-cylinder bank, creating a fire-breathing monster under the cowling. At low speeds, these engines sputtered and coughed, but once the throttle slammed wide open, they came alive with terrifying ferocity. Fuel consumption skyrocketed, spark plugs fouled constantly, and the richness of the mixture often sent flames roaring out of the exhaust. Fires weren't rare, they were expected. It didn't take long for regulators to intervene. Non-marine carburetors were banned, cited for their uncontrollable throttle response and extreme fire hazard. Yet, in that brief, dangerous era, these fuel-hungry engines redefined what an outboard could do, turning ordinary boats into weapons of speed and chaos. Then came the ruthless art of shaving cylinder heads. Boosting compression is the oldest trick in the performance playbook, and outboard racers embraced it like a secret weapon. By milling the cylinder heads far beyond factory limits, they cranked combustion pressure to levels the engine was never designed to survive. The results were breathtaking and terrifying. Power exploded off the line, leaving every stock engine in the dust. But the risks were extreme. Pistons detonated in fiery destruction, bearings failed without warning, and engines teetered on the brink of self-destruction with every second they ran. These boats could outrun almost anything on the water, but only for short adrenaline-fueled bursts. When engines began catastrophically failing, dumping fuel and oil directly into lakes and rivers, environmental agencies joined racing authorities in clamping down. Excessive head milling was banned, marking the end of one of the most dangerous chapters in outboard speed history. Yet for a brief, furious moment, these boats raced like untamed beasts, barely held in check by steel and luck. The sixth modification was both daring and downright terrifying. Lightweight flywheels, or sometimes no flywheels at all. The flywheel's job is simple: stabilize engine rotation and smooth out power delivery. Remove that mass and suddenly the engine reacts instantly, revving like a wild animal at the slightest touch of the throttle. A dream for racing starts and explosive sprints. But the thrill came with chaos. Without enough flywheel mass, throttle response became unpredictable. Engines stalled at the worst moments, leaving boats dead in the water. And the danger wasn't just mechanical, it was explosive. Flywheels spinning at thousands of RPM occasionally shredded themselves, sending deadly shrapnel ripping through the cowling and, in some cases, striking the driver. After several horrifying accidents, regulators had no choice. Lightweight flywheels were heavily restricted, and in many classes completely banned. It was a harsh lesson in how far speed enthusiasts were willing to push a machine, and themselves, on the water. Seventh on the list was the devilish art of altered port timing. Two-stroke outboards rely on perfectly timed intake and exhaust ports, a delicate dance that controls power and efficiency. Racers ignore the choreography. They reshaped ports by hand, raised exhaust timing, and widened intakes, forcing engines to scream far beyond anything the factory intended. The effect was astonishing and brutal. Top-end speed skyrocketed, but low-end torque vanished. Boats struggled to get on plane, lurching awkwardly at first, then transforming into unstoppable rockets once they hit full stride. Engines ran hotter than ever, burned oil at alarming rates, and often seized without warning, leaving drivers helpless mid-run. These modified blocks were so far removed from stock that inspectors had little hope of keeping up. The only solution regulators could enforce was to ban porting entirely in many classes, closing the door on one of the most radical and dangerous speed hacks in outboard history. The eighth modification pushed fuel into extreme territory. Pump gas couldn't compete, so racers turned to aviation fuel, race gas, methanol, and even nitromethane. These fuels allowed insane compression and aggressive ignition timing, unleashing staggering speed. But the danger wasn't just on the water. Storing volatile fuel became a hazard. Spills ignited easily, and engines ran scorching hot externally, sparking fire risks. Environmental damage added another layer of concern. The reckless fuel experiments couldn't continue. Racing authorities stepped in, mandating approved fuel types and effectively ending the anything goes era, proving that sometimes raw power comes at an almost unthinkable cost. Ninth was all about pushing the engine higher than ever with extreme jack plates. Hydraulic and mechanical systems let racers raise the engine while running, slashing lower unit drag to almost nothing. At maximum height, only the propellers skimmed the water. Boats soared to speeds no one thought possible for outboards, but control vanished. A slight turn could trigger a violent spin, and blowovers became routine. Thrills came with terror. After multiple accidents, racing authorities cracked down, imposing strict engine height limits and mandatory safety gear. What was once an edge of insanity speed hack became a stark lesson in how the thin line between genius and disaster really was. The final and most controversial modification was the hybrid powerhead. Racers started mixing parts from different manufacturers, creating Frankenstein engines that were faster and far stranger than anything the factories made. Mercury blocks mated to Yamaha heads, OMC midsections paired with custom-built power heads. Nothing was standard, everything was extreme. These monsters dominated races until inspectors threw up their hands. Rules couldn't keep up, entire classes were restructured or scrapped. Out of the chaos came modern spec racing, where every engine is identical, and competition is measured by skill, not who could cobble together the most illegal, terrifying combination of parts. What makes these illegal modifications so fascinating isn't just the speed, it's how much of today's outboard technology was born from them. High-mounted water pickups, precision machining, turned exhaust paths, stronger flywheels, smarter fuel systems. All of it traces back to a time when speed mattered more than safety. These boats didn't just fly across the water, they forced the industry to grow up. And for a brief, dangerous window in history, outboards were less about boating and more about surviving the ride. If you're fascinated by the outlaw engineering that turned ordinary boats into flying monsters, hit like and subscribe, and dive into more shocking stories of speed and danger on the water.